He was 19, shaking, alone, flying his first real mission over Germany, and seconds away from dying. But in that moment, when every rule said he was finished, he did something no pilot had ever tried, a move so reckless, so impossible, it rewrote the future of air combat. Charles L. Woodchuck Yeager was born on February 13, 1923, in the small town of Myra, West Virginia, and raised in the nearby community of Hamlin. His childhood was shaped by the realities of the Great Depression. His father worked long, dangerous hours in the natural gas fields and coal operations that dominated the region, while his mother kept the household running with the bare essentials. There were no privileges, no connections, and no expectations that a boy from Lincoln County would ever see the inside of a fighter cockpit. Life in rural Appalachia demanded a kind of practical intelligence. Yeager learned to hunt from a young age, not as a hobby, but as a way to put food on the family table. Long days moving through dense woods sharpened his eyesight and hand-eye coordination to a degree that stunned Air Force examiners years later. His vision tested at an extraordinary 20/10, twice as sharp as the average pilot. But in the 1930s, no one imagined that trait would matter. His education was basic. He graduated from high school in 1941 with no plans for college and no aviation background. Flying was something other people did. Men with means, men from cities, men with access to private clubs and university programs. Yeager seemed destined for a life similar to his father's: hard work, limited opportunity, and little chance to escape the economic gravity of Appalachia. Everything changed when the United States inched closer to entering World War II. In September 1941, Yeager enlisted in the Army Air Forces, not as a pilot trainee, but as an aircraft mechanic. The job fit his practical skills. He learned the internal systems of the P-51 Airacobra at Tonopah, Nevada. Working long hours maintaining machines he assumed he would never fly, but global events created gaps no one expected. Combat losses in 1942 pushed the Air Forces into a desperate search for new pilots. The creation of the Flying Sergeant program allowed enlisted men, even those without elite backgrounds, to apply for pilot training. Yeager volunteered immediately. Despite his modest education, instructors quickly recognized an uncommon natural ability. His mechanical knowledge, exceptional vision, and calm reflexes elevated him above many better educated candidates. By March 1943, he had earned his wings. By November, he was in England, and within months, the boy who wasn't supposed to be a pilot was climbing into a P-51 Mustang, one of the most advanced fighters of the war, on the edge of the greatest air battles in history. By late 1943, the United States Army Air Forces faced a crisis that threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign over Europe. The daylight bombing strategy, the belief that heavily armed B-17s and B-24s could punch their way into Germany without crippling fighter escort, was collapsing under the weight of reality. The numbers were devastating. On August 17, 1943, during the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day. More than 600 airmen were killed or captured within hours. 2 months later, the second Schweinfurt raid proved even worse. 62 bombers downed in one operation, a loss rate exceeding 20%. A bomber crewman needed to complete 25 missions to finish a tour, but statistically, most wouldn't survive half of that. The problem was range. American escort fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning lacked the fuel capacity to follow bombers deep into Germany. They could protect formations over the Channel and along the western frontier, but as soon as they turned back, the Luftwaffe descended with lethal efficiency. German fighters, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, attacked in waves, striking isolated bomber groups at the exact moment they were most vulnerable. But even when escorts were present, another issue undermined American pilots. Their own doctrine, U.S. fighter tactics, were rooted in pre-war theory developed at the Air Corps' tactical school. Instructors who had learned to fly in the 1920s and early 1930s emphasized tight formation flying, strict positional discipline, and coordinated attacks. Manuals discouraged individual maneuvering. Pilots were expected to maintain formation integrity, above all else, even when under direct threat against inexperienced enemies. Such discipline might have worked, but Germany's fighter arm had been forged in years of combat experience. Spain, Poland, France, the Battle of Britain, and the vast skies over the Eastern Front. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots refined the finger for formation, emphasizing flexibility, initiative, and energy management. A German pilot could break formation, pursue, disengage, or improvise based on the situation. American pilots could not. The results were stark. By late 1943, Luftwaffe aces were achieving kill ratios of 3 to 4 American fighters for every aircraft they lost. Some, like Egon Mayer and Walter Nowotny, exceeded kill ratios of 10 to 1. When U.S. fighters attempted to protect bombers using rigid doctrine, they were often outmaneuvered, outpositioned, and overwhelmed. Young pilots arriving in England, many barely out of training, were thrown into this environment with little preparation for the reality of air combat. They faced experienced German pilots, superior tactical systems, and missions that pushed them far beyond the reach of their escorts. For men like Charles "Chuck" Yeager, survival was not expected. The doctrine was flawed, the enemy was experienced, and every deep strike mission into Germany was, statistically, a one-way trip. On December 20, 1943, Charles "Chuck" Yeager lifted off from RAF Leiston for what would become his first major combat engagement. The mission was a deep penetration escort toward Bremen, one of the most heavily defended industrial regions in northwestern Germany. The Luftwaffe had concentrated fighter units around the city, knowing that American bombers targeting its shipyards and factories posed a growing threat. It was exactly the kind of mission where losses were expected before pilots even reached the target. Yeager, 19 years old and flying one of his earliest operational sorties, was part of a Mustang flight assigned to shield the bomber stream as it crossed into German airspace. Below him stretched a formation of B-17s and B-24s, thousands of men trusting the thin perimeter of fighters above them. The weather was clear, ideal for interception, and radar reports had already warned of large numbers of German fighters climbing to meet them. As the formation approached the outskirts of Bremen, the Luftwaffe struck. Units from Jagdgeschwader 11 and other nearby groups rose to intercept, including experienced pilots who had survived years on multiple fronts. Among them were men with dozens of confirmed victories, veterans accustomed to fighting against rigid American tactics. Yeager became separated from his element during the early maneuvers. In the confusion of the initial interception, scattered bursts of flak and the coordinated attack runs of German fighters disrupted escort patterns. When Yeager checked his mirrors, he saw the worst possible sight: a Bf-109 closing fast from his rear quarter. The aircraft behind him was flown by an experienced pilot, the kind who had spent years refining his craft on operational fronts stretching from France to Russia. In these moments, training dictated a standard response. American doctrine emphasized staying with one's wingman, maintaining altitude, and executing predictable defensive turns designed to preserve formation integrity. Pilots were explicitly warned not to break formation without orders. Improvisation was discouraged. A pilot who abandoned his position risked not only danger but disciplinary action. But the situation unfolding behind Yeager rendered those rules irrelevant. The Bf-109 approached with deliberate precision, settling into the ideal firing position. German pilots had mastered the art of coordinated attacks. A short burst from its 20mm cannon or 13mm machine guns could tear through the P-51's coolant system or control surfaces, ending the engagement in seconds. Yeager realized he had no time. Standard defensive maneuvers would only delay the inevitable. He was alone, low on ammunition, and facing a veteran opponent with altitude advantage. In that brief instant, a moment measured in heartbeats, he understood the truth that every pilot eventually learned: doctrine could not save him. The manual offered no escape. Remaining in formation would mean presenting the German ace with a stable, predictable target. Attempting to climb or execute prescribed turns would only make it easier for the attacker to bracket him. The Mustang shook under the pressure of the closing enemy aircraft. The gun ports of the Bf-109 aligned with deadly intent. It was at this moment, with seconds left before the German pilot opened fire, that Yeager faced a decision no manual could prepare him for, a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. What happened next was not part of any training syllabus, nor did it resemble anything written in the Army Air Force's tactical manuals. With the Bf-109 closing rapidly and the standard defensive options exhausted, Charles "Chuck" Yeager made a decision that contradicted everything he had been taught. He rolled the P-51 inverted and pushed the nose straight down into a near vertical dive. To American pilots in 1943, this was considered suicide. The The Bf-109, with its fuel-injected Daimler-Benz engine, was believed to hold a decisive advantage in negative G maneuvers. U.S. fighters, built with carbureted engines, were known to briefly starve for fuel when pushed into negative G dives. German pilots had exploited this weakness since the early stages of the war. The doctrine was clear: never dive away from a 109. Yet, upside down at nearly 25,000 feet, Yeager committed to the maneuver. The Mustang dropped into the plunge, gravity pulling it downward like a stone. The altimeter spun. Airspeed climbed through 350 miles per hour, then 400, then higher still. The frame began to shudder as aerodynamic forces built on the wings and control surfaces. It was during this plunge that Yeager experienced the physiological strain of the dive. The rapid acceleration forced blood away from the brain, narrowing his field of vision into a gray tunnel. His peripheral sight faded. The control stick stiffened under his hands. As compressibility effects began to creep in, early signs of airflow nearing transonic behavior. P-51s had been tested at high speeds, but few frontline pilots had ever taken the aircraft to its structural limits. Behind him, the Bf-109 followed. German pilots were trained to pursue diving targets aggressively. At typical combat speeds, the 109 could match or outpace most Allied fighters in a descent. For a moment, the German pilot remained in firing range, closing the distance as both aircraft screamed downward through the freezing air. Then the unexpected happened. Instead of losing speed, the outcome American doctrine predicted. The P-51's Packard-built Merlin engine began to generate more power. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, designed to optimize high-altitude performance, reacted differently in a high-speed dive than engineers had anticipated. As Yeager's speed increased, the Mustang's aerodynamic design allowed it to continue, accelerating beyond what the Bf-109 could sustain without risking structural failure. The gap widened inside the cockpit. Yeager fought to maintain consciousness and control as the Mustang's airspeed indicator pushed past 500 miles per hour. The control stick felt almost immovable. The aircraft was approaching the edge of what any P-51 could safely endure. The earth below rushed upward at alarming speed. At approximately 1,500 feet, Yeager pulled with both hands. The G-forces slammed him into his seat, restoring color to his vision but threatening to tear the wings from the airframe. The Mustang leveled out just above the treetops. The Bf-109 could not match the pullout. Its pilot was forced to recover earlier, bleeding off critical energy during the transition. When Yeager looked back, the impossible became clear. The attacker, who had nearly killed him, was now slow, exposed, and out of position. In a single, instinctive maneuver, one dismissed as impossible by senior officers, Yeager had uncovered a performance edge in the P-51 that no American tactician had recognized. A mistake that should have ended his life instead became the key to a new way of fighting. When Charles "Chuck" Yeager landed back at his base in England, the ground crews immediately saw the strain on his aircraft: overheated engine, stressed control surfaces, and a film of oil residue across the fuselage. What they could not see was the maneuver that had saved his life at altitude. That explanation came later. During the debriefing, Yeager described the encounter exactly as it had happened: the sudden attack, the vertical inversion, the near supersonic dive, and the moment when the Bf-109 fell behind, unable to match the Mustang's acceleration. It was a straightforward account, given without exaggeration, but the reaction inside the briefing room was immediate, and hostile senior officers dismissed the story outright. They insisted the Bf-109's fuel-injected engine made it superior in negative G flight. They argued that the German fighter's diving characteristics were well established. According to doctrine, Yeager should not have survived. Therefore, the maneuver could not have occurred as described. Some officers suggested he had misidentified the aircraft type. Others implied that stress and fear had clouded his memory. The gun camera footage, shaken by the violent dive, offered no clear proof. The skepticism had roots deeper than Yeager's experience. American tactical doctrine had been built over years of pre-war theory, shaped by instructors who had flown biplanes in the 1920s and early 1930s. Their manuals emphasized formation discipline, altitude control, and predictability. The idea that an inexperienced pilot had uncovered a flaw in the system, especially through a maneuver that contradicted the manual, was difficult for many to accept. Yet Yeager was not alone. Within days, similar reports surfaced. Pilots from other squadrons described unexpected acceleration advantages. When the Mustang was pushed beyond 450 miles per hour in steep dives, Lieutenant William Wisner of the 352nd Fighter Group recounted a near-vertical descent that allowed him to escape FW-190s. Others mentioned control stiffening at high speeds, followed by a sudden performance edge that German fighters could not match. Each report weakened the certainty of the old doctrine. What had first been dismissed as an anomaly began to appear as a pattern. Engineers and experienced pilots took note. The Mustang's two-stage, two-speed supercharger, optimized for high-altitude performance, was producing effects in extreme dives that had not been fully evaluated under combat conditions. Suspicion turned into curiosity. Curiosity became a question. And that question, whether the P-51 possessed untapped high-speed capabilities, began to crack the system that had governed American fighter tactics since before the war. The chain of events set in motion by Yeager's survival forced commanders to reconsider the foundation of their doctrine. What had been rejected as impossible was now impossible to ignore. As more pilots repeated maneuvers similar to Charles "Chuck" Yeager's dive, the reports could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents or misremembered engagements. The 8th Air Force now faced a choice: ignore these accounts and preserve doctrine, or investigate them and risk overturning the foundation of American air tactics. The turning point came when Colonel Don Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group and one of the most respected combat leaders in the European theater, decided to conduct tests himself. Blakesley was already known for pushing aircraft to their limits. In early January 1944, he took a P-51 Mustang to 25,000 feet above the English Channel and initiated a series of controlled high-speed dives. The results stunned him. As the Mustang dropped through 20,000 feet, its acceleration increased beyond what any American manual predicted. At speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour, the aircraft continued to pick up velocity, outpacing the rates documented for German fighters. Control stiffening occurred, but it did not prevent the Mustang from maintaining stability. Blakesley repeated the tests multiple times, confirming what frontline pilots had been reporting for weeks. He prepared a detailed report and presented it to Fighter Command. The reaction was explosive. Senior officers who had built their careers on pre-war doctrine challenged the findings. They argued that German aircraft, equipped with fuel-injected engines and lighter airframes, should retain superiority in dives. Some claimed the data must be flawed. Others insisted pilots were endangering themselves by exceeding the aircraft's intended limits. But there was one man with enough authority and enough battlefield experience to override them. Major General William Kepner, commander of 8th Fighter Command, had flown in World War I and had witnessed firsthand how rigid doctrine cost lives. Kepner reviewed Blakesley's data, read pilot accounts, and considered the toll German fighters were taking on bomber formations. He did not hesitate. On February 3, 1944, he issued a directive that broke sharply from decades of American tactical thinking. Pilots were authorized to use individual initiative. High-speed diving attacks were not only permitted, they were encouraged. Formation rigidity was loosened. The new focus centered on energy fighting, using altitude and speed as interchangeable forms of advantage, exploiting kinetic energy to dictate the terms of combat. The transformation was immediate. Just weeks later came Big Week. Beginning on February 20, 1944, more than 1,000 American bombers struck aircraft factories across Germany, escorted by P-51s operating under Kepner's revised doctrine. When the Luftwaffe rose to intercept, they encountered an American fighter force unlike any they had faced before. Instead of predictable formations, Mustangs plunged from altitude with enormous speed, executing slashing attacks that disrupted German runs before they reached the bomber streams. The kill ratios reflected the shift. In January, the 8th Air Force averaged approximately 2-to-1 against the Luftwaffe. By April, it surged beyond 4-to-1. By June, it exceeded 6-to-1. The new tactics reached their full expression over Berlin. Veteran German pilots, accustomed to dictating engagements, found themselves outrun, outclimbed, and outmaneuvered. The P-51's high-speed performance, once theoretical, was now a decisive battlefield advantage. Luftwaffe diaries and post-war analyses noted the same pattern. American fighters were suddenly fighting like Germans, using energy, speed, and initiative to dominate the airspace. A single dive, once dismissed as impossible, had exposed a flaw in the old doctrine and revealed the true power of the Mustang. What began with the instincts of a 19-year-old pilot now reshaped the entire air war over Europe. By early 1944, Charles "Chuck" Yeager had become far more than the young pilot who survived an impossible dive. The new tactics spreading through the fighter groups, rooted in energy management and high-speed maneuvering, transformed the way he fought. As doctrine shifted, so did the odds. The P-51 Mustang was finally being used to its full potential. Yeager's combat record began reflecting this change almost immediately. With each engagement, he gained confidence in the aircraft's strengths, its acceleration in dives, its climb rate, and its ability to retain energy through slashing attacks. The rigid formations of 1943 had given way to a style of fighting that allowed pilots to dictate the terms of battle. Yeager excelled in this environment. On multiple occasions, he encountered experienced Luftwaffe opponents, men who had accumulated years of frontline combat. Among them were pilots of Jagdgeschwader units that had once dominated the skies of Europe. Their tactics, perfected over Spain, France, and Russia, had overwhelmed Allied pilots for years. But now, those same units found themselves confronting American fighters approaching from higher altitudes, steeper dives, and unexpected angles. One of Yeager's most notable encounters came on March 5, 1944, when he and other pilots from the 357th Fighter Group engaged a formation of Bf-109s attempting to reach a bomber stream southwest of Berlin. Using the energy-fighting methods now endorsed by Fighter Command, Yeager dove from altitude toward the German aircraft, closing rapidly before the enemy pilots could react. In the brief engagement that followed, he scored multiple victories, contributing to a performance that earned the 357th the nickname the Oxford Boys. The effect on bomber crews was immediate and profound. Airmen who had once braced for catastrophic losses during deep strike missions now watched Mustang fighters tear through German interceptors. Long before they reached the bomber formations, diaries and letters home from B-17 and B-24 crews reflected a visible shift, confidence replacing fear, relief replacing resignation. Yeager's rising kill count was not just a record of victories in the sky. It represented lives preserved in the formations below. Each German fighter destroyed meant a bomber not attacked, a crew not lost, a mission not aborted. German morale suffered in equal measure. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots wrote of engagements where Mustangs appeared out of the sun in high-speed dives from impossible angles. They struggled to maintain cohesion under the pressure of slashing attacks that exploited the energy advantages American fighters now fully understood. Many of the Luftwaffe's most experienced aces were lost during this period. Replacements, often rushed through abbreviated training programs, entered combat with little chance of survival. Kill ratios reflected the shift. By mid-1944, American fighters in the 8th Air Force achieved exchange rates once considered unreachable. The Luftwaffe, bleeding pilots and fuel, could no longer mount the concentrated attacks that had devastated bomber formations in 1943. Yeager's personal contributions were part of a broader transformation that reshaped the European air war. Each engagement demonstrated how one tactical shift, born from a single, desperate dive, altered not just the outcome of fighter battles, but the fate of thousands flying high above Europe. The skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe were now defended by a new generation of American pilots who fought with speed, initiative, and the lessons learned in the moments between life and death. By the end of World War II, Charles "Chuck" Yeager had secured his place among the most respected American fighter pilots of the European air campaign. His victories were documented, his missions recorded, and his role in shaping the P-51 Mustang's combat style recognized by those who fought beside him. Yet the significance of his contribution reached far beyond the number of enemy aircraft he destroyed. The accidental discovery he made in December 1943, a discovery born not from theory, but from instinct, became a cornerstone of modern air combat doctrine. The principles of energy fighting, once resisted by pre-war tacticians, evolved into universal truths taught to every new generation of fighter pilots. Altitude became energy, speed became life, maneuvering became a science of momentum, not choreography. These ideas shaped aerial combat from the jet age to the present, but Yeager never claimed credit for the shift. To him, the maneuver that changed his life was simply a reaction, a moment of survival when no other option existed. He spoke about it later with characteristic humility, attributing his actions to instinct, training, and the Mustang's design rather than to any personal brilliance. After the war, Yeager continued to push the boundaries of flight. In 1947, he became the first human to break the sound barrier in the Bell X-1, a moment that defined the dawn of modern aviation. His test pilot career marked him as one of the central figures in the transition from propeller-driven aircraft to high-performance jets. The same calm under pressure that had saved him over Germany now guided him through the most dangerous research flights of the era. Yet, despite international recognition for his achievements in the post-war years, many accounts of World War II mention only the broad strokes: the Mustang, the escort missions, the air superiority won in 1944, the individual pilots whose instincts expose the flaws in outdated doctrine, often drift quietly into the margins of history. Yeager's own story is a reminder that innovation frequently comes from those least expected to lead it. A boy from rural West Virginia, with no formal preparation for the world he would enter, rewrote the laws of aerial engagement simply because he refused to die according to the rules someone else had written. His experience stands as an enduring lesson. Breakthroughs do not always come from committees, theories, or established experts. Sometimes they come from the outsider, the underdog, the young pilot who did not yet know what was impossible. The legacy of that dive is not just a change in tactics. It is a testament to the courage to trust instinct, the resolve to act under pressure, and the truth that history can turn on the decisions of those who were never meant to reshape it.